Good morning and welcome to Psych Talk, where we talk psychology and then some. I'm your host, Sean Hupel, and today we're going to be talking about parenting in America. Yeah, that's going to be a fun one, isn't it? But not from the perspective you think. You see, we can pick up parenting books left and right, we can pick up all that stuff. I'm not talking about the new generation. I'm talking about the ones that were raised. So, I'm going to go a little hokey at first because, well, America. And speaking of, there is a trend to where people are just unhappy with parenting. You can come from the top, you can come from the bottom. It don't matter. People are unhappy with how they were parented. Like a huge mass of people. You doubt me? Go ahead and just type hashtag trauma in a Google search. Seriously, try it out. You will find so much. And the big deal about that was we have kids raising kids. We always have. I mean, some people, they wait until they're older. You know, the more mature folks, the ones that learn. But we're pretty much a society of babies raising babies. It's why each new generation doesn't seem to be getting better than the last. Doesn't seem to. But then again, baby boomers, they were the start of issues because they spoiled their children, kinda, ish. They had a bunch of babies, and then their children ended up having babies, and they spoiled their babies. How do I know this? I was raised by them. But there were also expectations. There was a phrase called keeping up with the Jeffersons. So basically the neighbors get this, and then the other neighbors have to get that and better. And there was always this competition for privilege. Because that's what it was, like having the white picket fence. Where do you think that came from? The green grass, perfectly mowed, white picket fence, and hi neighbor. What generation do you think that came from? And how much of that do you think was actually real? So follow me on this. We are a nation of people that front. And I swear this is going to tie to parenting. But we're a nation of people that are constantly fronting. We've got to put on a face. We've got to put on a show. We've got to dress right. We've got to act right. Otherwise, peer pressure, social interactions, and all of that good stuff that ties into what we deem as our own self-worth. And that's where parenting comes into play. So, my generation, I am a millennial, the tail end of it. And I had to hesitate saying millennial because I still don't like the stereotypes associated. But that's the thing. We're catching up with the stereotypes. The reason we don't like stereotypes as millennials is because a lot of them are untrue. And I know every generation says that, but then again, who said, oh, every generation says that? Seriously, that started with baby boomers. And a little bit earlier. Like in America, with the trend that we have now of privilege versus self-sufficiency, yeah, that started about that time. But then again, we were in wars and post-wars. And so now we've got a nation of, well, we had a nation of parents trying to give their children everything they didn't have, while also trying to meet social expectations. And so parents ended up living vicariously through their children. They would take them on vacations and all of that. I actually had some of that myself. And yeah, the vacations were neat. But then, when the parents wanted to go, and the child didn't, there's no compromise. There's no listening to the child. There never was there? If you're a millennial, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think it was what came before millennials? I can't remember. Because it wasn't just baby boomers. There was one in between. that we call the greatest generation. Not, but there was one generation in between. And what's funny about that is, it is what it is. That generation understood, okay, my parents are working, so I pretty much got to raise myself. And then those people who raised themselves, who had parents that were working all the time and had certain expectations, they learned about those expectations and they adopted them. We haven't had real parenting as a nation for a while. Oh, and you'll have to excuse the voice. I just got over being sick. Happens once a year. But as a nation, we tend to ignore what's right in front of our face. I mean, look at global warming. We think we can put things off. We can ignore them until later. Oh, it'll be fine. Oh, we'll get to it. And that's what developed the honey-do list. Because you had these people who worked long and hard jobs to provide for their families and be good men. Because our country's was misogynistic, still kind of is. And men were the providers. Women were the stay-at-home moms and all of that. And people weren't being fulfilled back then, they were making it by. And what that does when you're not self-actualized is you tend to get a little bit frustrated. And what's the easiest target to take your frustration out on? Think about it. Taking candy from a what? And that's because they're vulnerable. And of course we've got generational traumas. I mean, there was definitely abuse in the earlier generations of my family that was covered up. And it's one of those that we don't talk about it. Keep that phrase in mind. We don't talk about it. Now today, if I were to think about that, I wouldn't hide those kind of things from a child. But then again, you had social expectations and prudence. So what ends up happening from that? When people live by social expectations, it opens the door to insecurity. What do I mean? So let's say you don't live up to social expectations. Let's say somebody shames you and engages in projected schadenfreude. Which, by the way, if you're new to this whole show right here, Autistic Commando on YouTube or Autistic Commando on TikTok, but on YouTube you can catch up all the previous episodes. Everything I'm saying kind of ties to previous episodes, so it's kind of linear. So feel free to catch up. And you are certainly welcome to comment. I am happy to answer questions on YouTube. And that was me being hungry. But we have these parents that all of a sudden are parents. And they're unfulfilled. They have to work on this grueling job. You do what you gotta do. That was the baby boomer generation's term. Then the following generation, it is what it is. Tell me I'm wrong. Seriously. Ask anybody from those generations, tell me I'm wrong. And then you have Gen Y, because why? Well, let's just stick to the older generations and we'll move our way forward, because this is all going to tie together and you're going to see how this, you should have an idea by the end of this show, how this is going to impact, or how it did impact America, and our economy, and our jobs, and everything else that makes us American. America. So, you've got these generations where one had to fight plenty of wars, or hard wars. And then you had another generation that learned what hard work was. Both those generations were not self-actualized. Both those generations tended to skip out on vacations and all of that. Tended to skip out on fun. Both those generations, a lot of times, didn't have much of a childhood. I mean, that's why, like my generation, my parents are pushing their oh God, they're pushing their 70s. And excuse the terminology, but the 70s, wow, they're they're old. And now that I'm halfway there, I don't think it's that old. But it took maturity to get to this point because when I was a kid, my age right now would be old. And it's all a matter of perspective. So, when I was a kid, my parents at first couldn't afford much. I was a little kid. I was living in the parsonage for Christ Lutheran Church in Salem, Oregon, on State Street. 4444 State Street. I remember that because that's one that even a kid can remember. You know, like 4444. Okay, cool. And don't talk to strangers. Stranger danger. And then, of course, there were the stickers for Mr. Yuck. Don't drink this. Those were fond memories. And we went camping at Detroit Lake, which doesn't exist anymore because of Oregon wildfires. But it'll come back. And we would, when my father's business started to pick up, he owned RH Factor Insurance in Lancaster. And it was over by Elephant, it's not a cafe, but it was like Elephant Burgers or something like that. And their burgers were halfway decent. But yeah, I remember all of that. And as he came up, we started taking vacations at the inn at Spanish Head, which was awesome. Like literally, you could take an elevator down to the beach. It rocked. And it's over in Newport, if I remember right. Newport, Oregon. But I love that place. It was awesome. And the food wasn't bad either if you got like room service or went to the restaurant. But he really, really loved taking us on vacations. And he really enjoyed spoiling me. But he didn't have much time for me. And my mother, she was always helping him out. Like, she always had his back in his corner. Always. She was at RH Factor all the time. And I mean, she was pulling her own with him. Like, they were working together. And I was raised by Grams, a woman who was going to be a literal nun. In my earlier years, I really enjoyed Goodwill toys. Like, no joke. Like, you can enjoy those things. It's all about the spirit that you have, not the spirit that, you know, it's not about possessions. But after you get spoiled, I'm autistic, so I had expectations. Now it became a rule. And every year you get another gift, like an extra one for each year. Like, I don't know. It was something childish and stupid and all of that, and, you know, whatever. But I remember all of it. Now, I also remember when I didn't want to go on a camping trip during my teenage years. I wanted to stay home. I wanted to do homework and such. And I wanted to spend time with friends. I didn't want to spend time in a forest with nothing to do. At that point, my interests expanded. But I had to go. I was old enough to stay on my own, but I had to go. And so, that created a bit of a challenge. Like, I really, really didn't want to be there. But my parents wanted me to be there. They wanted to live through me. In a way. Vicariously. And we had a whole generation of that. Where parents would push expectations on children. And that's the thing is, there were certain moral and social expectations that were expected of myself. They were expected of my peers. But they weren't always taught. And when they were taught, they weren't always taught from a place of compassion. They were taught from a place of frustration. And, I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm not the only person I know that was kicked out at 18 without a single adult skill taught by their parents. I was given a lot of things. I was given a car. 1990 Plymouth Acclaim. And then my dad threw back about 6 to 8 cold ones and decided, wow, this would be cool to paint blue birds on the side. And sure enough, I would drive that to school, and when it was cold, the car chirped. Because the belt was, it was a 1990 Plymouth Acclaim. Great gas mileage, reliable as all get out. And the belt whistled when it was cold. Or more specifically, chirped. My generation was given a lot of things. We were treated, we were spoiled, overall. And through that being spoiled and not having parents around us, we learned, like, by having parents working all the time. Some of us had parents that stayed home and taught, usually the mother, and some of us didn't. I know quite a few that didn't. A lot of them had to raise themselves. And I know a lot of people that were kicked out at 18 without any adult skills. And then the previous generation didn't apologize for any of it. Now, why do I bring up all this stuff? Why do I bring up the sob story? We had a couple generations of basically kids raising kids. Meaning, parents were working or fighting wars. And the kids kind of had to, survive free-range parenting, And some of them enjoyed paint chips because they were sweet. And didn't have anybody to really say, no, that's got lead in it. But then again, we also didn't know the true detrimental effects of lead and what it can do to the brain because we didn't have the technology back then. There was a certain level of ignorance overall in the United States of America. And that ignorance is carried because people are working and working and working and working. I just spent the last year getting over the traumas of nonstop working and just living in the world and all of that. And I'm not the only one. I'm seriously not the only one. There's so many. And people are coming together and healing as a generation. But the older generations, they're kind of stuck in their ways, aren't they? Think of that phrase, stuck in their ways. And no, this isn't a bashing session either. Because they didn't know. And their parents didn't know. Their parents didn't have the time. And when they did have the time, they were tired. And so they worked. They did what they knew. And then when they did have the time, they were tired. They wanted to watch Babylon 5 and Star Trek. Get an escape from the monotony of working in a factory. The monotony of selling insurance. The monotony of working in the post office or in a grocery store. We get tied into these loops that basically take away from our free time to self-actualize. And then we end up having kids. Because, there's more than one type of escapism, and sometimes that results in a child being born. Okay, that's a thing. Ask anybody from the 70s. So, what I say all this to say is, we've got a certain level of lack of education in this country, but we also have a certain level of privilege. Because when parents don't have anything, like most parents are good parents. Most parents have heart for it. They want to. But if they don't have the tools to be able to do so, that's a bit of a challenge. If they don't have the knowledge tools to do so. Because, I basically blew my 20s trying to survive. Because I didn't have the knowledge to be an adult. So I had to learn how to be one. Among all these other people that are learning how to be one. And during that time, some people developed personalities that were giving. Some people developed personalities that were taking. And some people are just straight out Machiavellian. And you know what? To each their own. As long as you don't disenfranchise another person. to each their own. But when you don't have something and you become a parent that actually does care, whether by accident or by design, you want your children to have better. But when you don't have an education because your parents were always working, when you aren't educated on how to raise a child properly, how to teach the morals and values that you upheld, when you don't know how to teach in a way that that child can respond to or understand, and they have to kind of learn on their own too, even though you said, well, do this, or else. Reward punishment system. We're all familiar with it, because we live in it. That's what the law is. And to be perfectly honest, well, I think, I'm not even going to get into that. I'm not going to touch law today. But we will from a psychological perspective. But when you have parents that didn't have, they want their children to have. And so you had baby boomers that were successful trying to spoil their kids. And then you had their kids trying to spoil their kids. And all the time working, not having the time and the energy to teach those kids. And they're kids. They're going to be rebellious here and there. They're going to make mistakes here and there. They're going to have different types of personalities. That's life. But when lessons aren't taught, knowledge starts to get lost. That's why we have history. That's why we have textbooks. It's so that knowledge doesn't get lost, and so that knowledge can be shared. And my generation came up often spoiled, and with parents trying to keep up with the Jeffersons, trying to maintain appearance, maintain poise. And their child was seen as a reflection of them and their parenting capabilities. And so parents who didn't have would often spoil the child, but also place demands on the child to live vicariously because the parent didn't have the opportunity that they're trying to provide for the child. But here's the thing. Another aspect of parenting is crisis moments. So you get these crisis moments, right? Like, the kid just did that. They just did. What am I supposed to do? And in those moments, we revert back to, generally, human beings, revert back to what we know, what we've seen, what we've experienced. Because, it worked for us, right? We came out fine. Ever heard that phrase? And so, you've got parents that, whooping your child here and there, like once or twice, yeah, that brings the lesson home. But really beating your child, like I have friends that were sent out to the yard to get their own switch. Meaning you break a tree branch. If it's not strong enough, your mom will send you back out there and you have to get a thicker one. And there were some parents that would beat their kids until that switch broke. They would take out their frustrations in life on that child that wasn't performing the way that they wanted that child to perform, through expectations that they never laid the foundation for. They never reinforced. The compassionate teaching was gone. And I'm going to take it a little bit further too, because what I just spoke of was a lower income household usually. So let's go to the middle class, because there was one in America at one point. So let's say you're a middle class family. Punishment would be the wooden spoon. I've actually heard that many times. In fact, my grandmother used it on me a couple times, because I was being extraordinarily rebellious. And you know what? I don't fault her for it. I don't fault her for the once or twice that she did. Because I was being rebellious enough and not listening enough that I think I deserved it. Because she was a pretty compassionate woman. And I was a pretty rebellious child. But then again, a lot of autistic individuals are. And that's mostly because we're bullied. We're bullied, then we project it back home in our actions and words. Excuse me. But when it came to Graham's raising me, there was always a level of compassion. And the 2 times that I remember her using a wooden spoon on me, she always taught a lesson afterwards. The wooden spoon wasn't used until it broke. It was used to get my attention when I was absolutely refusing to pay attention. And then she taught from a place of compassion. But she also wasn't working all the time. One thing I found is children that were partially raised by grandparents tend to be nicer people. They tend to be wiser. Because the grandparent will spend the time with that child. The time that they didn't have to spend with their own child. And that's pretty awesome. And not all grandparents are good. My grandmother was a saint. My grandfather was known as the drunk that was never drunk. And that's just because he was a mean-spirited person. He was very mean-spirited after the war. But that's another problem with America, is we're always in a war. And we've got parents coming home traumatized from that war. Because war and harming other people, that's not human. That is not something that should be human. It's not natural. To harm another of our own species is not natural. But some people, they think it's normal. Ergo, it's natural. No, it's naturalized. Naturalized is something you've been doing for so long that it almost becomes second nature. We've got trauma in this country. Black folks, they've got tons of trauma. I can't tell you how many of my friends are still apprehensive whenever they get pulled over. Extremely, extremely apprehensive. And then we had the George Floyd thing, which... but it's been going on so much longer than that. And so you've got those kind of traumas too. Latin Americans, Native Americans. The things that people go through because of the disregard of others that weren't raised in a nurturing environment. Like, you see how this spiral comes to the fore, where it carries from one end to the other. And we've got these individuals that some just want to project their insecurities. So let's talk police real quick. Police and parenting. So there was a study done in the 1990s. Yeah, 1990s. Because Grandma was still with me. She was the one that talked with me about it. She was like, did you know that over 80% of the police force, I think it was 86% of the police force, were bullied as kids? Which plays into the stereotype of, oh, they were bullied, but now they're the cop. And somebody who's felt powerless suddenly being given a position of power and authority. Yeah, that's something. There's a real thing about being drunk on power. A very real thing. And being drunk on power, well, that's not the greatest when you're a police officer. Which is why black and brown folks tend to be apprehensive. Those bullied officers became officers. Those bullied children. And keep in mind, when you have, for example, like, where do bullies come from? I discussed this in a previous episode. Again, Autistic Commando on YouTube. You can see the previous episodes. But when it came to where did this insecurity and bullying come from? Absentee parents, or parents that came back from the war, or parents that didn't get taught by parents and are just reacting according to what they know. Parents who only know that beating a child is how to get that child to respond. Parents who are taught by society not to talk about adult things to a child. No, the school will do it, or we'll get to it, or I'll tell you when you're older. Every phrase I just mentioned, people know those phrases because they're commonly repeated. They are generational phrases passed on to the next generation. So what's the solution, right? We've got kids raising kids, raising kids, raising kids. Well, I'll be perfectly honest. I'm in my mid-30s, which is such a weird thing to say. It feels so weird to be this old, or to have been living on this earth for this long. Like, I don't even want to use the word old, because it comes with this one connotation that says, things are falling apart. When in fact, the opposite is actually mostly true. We've got these new generations, but we also have knowledge. And what we're finding is, through multiple studies and, well, I mean just the past 20 years of study into childhood development, we're finding that we are realizing compassion is better. Teaching from a place of compassion. Taking the time. But knowledge is nothing without the ability to execute on that. And parents are still working. Like, I can't remember any time in my 20s that I didn't have 2 jobs. Or one that was a 12 to 16 hour a day job. Because when I was selling and slinging computers, that was one of those things where I didn't have free time. Like, I had free time between jobs or between working on a computer, but my apartment was like halfway completely filled with computers at one point, because I was selling computers in bulk to call centers. And I just used my apartment as a staging area because I didn't have a storefront. You do what you gotta do. That's my generation. You do what you gotta do. The generation before us, it is what it is. So, we've got these multiple generations, and they're constantly working and working and working. This capitalistic society is not working. Or it's not working for a lot of people. Some folks, they've done very well. If I had stayed in corporate America when I was in it instead of stepping out to start my own business, I would have been good. I'd probably be a regional manager or an executive director at this point. But I also don't know that I would feel fulfilled. And what if I didn't make director? What if I didn't make regional? What if I didn't even make district? What if I was just a regular manager, making, let's see, at $1.50 to $65,000 per year was respectable for a manager, up to $75,000 for a fast food restaurant manager. Well, if somebody calls in, you got to show up. Time was constantly spent. Like, I've been a fast food restaurant manager, and I've been a store manager for Blockbuster and Hollywood Video. And yeah, there's a lot of time invested into managing. And that's time away from family. When you spend that much time away from family and you're constantly working, you get tired. And you come back home and you don't want to teach. You don't want to spend time with your kids beyond doing fun stuff. Because fun, escapism, yay! I don't remember a math lesson that was taught to me by my parents. I don't. I know there were a few, but not many. Reading lessons, that was taught by Grams. And I'm not the only one. A lot of people ended up teaching themselves. And that can be unique. And some come out all right. Some really do teach themselves. And some learn from their peers, and some get lazy, some get privileged. Some maintain being spoiled in mentality, which can ultimately turn to narcissism, because when you don't have everything and you're like an adult now, what do? Like, no, I want to stay spoiled. I don't want to have to work so hard. And so you start going into manipulation, which in the old school days was spelling. True story. Like the old school, like, I'm not going to get into the biblical definition of, I already mentioned it. So biblical definition of witchcraft was partially manipulation. And that's up for debate on what it expounds into, like the other parts of that word. But yeah, manipulation. So, and I'm an NLP practitioner, or I was an NLP practitioner. So neuro-linguistic programming. And yeah, it's a very real thing, but it's also existed for 3,500 years. But it goes to prove that words have power. The way we raise our children have power. Because manipulation, gaslighting tactics, that's a real thing. And a lot of people are gaslighting because they just don't want to face the reality of the situation and own up to fault, because generations have been taught by their peers in society to live up to expectations. I told you, every show ties together. Like, I may dance around and whatnot, it'll all tie together. Well, first off, I'm going to apologize for the discontinuity for those of you watching me on YouTube or watching me on CCTV, because I need to step out and help some family. But every generation has different viewpoints. Every generation has different stimuli affecting what they're gonna become. Okay, I come from a different generation than my parents. And my surroundings are entirely different. And this next generation coming up, I look at my nieces and nephews that are in their teens now. They're little teens and 11 and 12 years old. And they're growing up. It's so weird to be an adult saying that. But yeah, they are growing up. And they're growing up in a completely different environment than I came up in. I'll give you a fun example of the difference of generational gaps, and then we'll go back into parenting. Well, actually, this was technically my parenting. 90s parenting. Let the TV and the computer do it for you. But so I am an OG video gamer. First person shooters, I'm an OG with that. OG means oh gangsta. But it's a term reflective of somebody who's been around the block a little bit. I was there in the early days of Counter-Strike. I was there in the early days of PlanetSide. I played Tribe's aerial assault on the PlayStation 2. I know the tactics. And I get a little bit beastly when I play. But these new kids, they got some new skills. They're taking on things from a different direction with Fortnite, right? Like Call of Duty and all those, same tactics, just a different day. But with Fortnite, you can actually build walls, you can build ramps, you can build forts, you can build things to basically add extra protection for you. And when I and my best friend, because we grew up together, he's a half a year older than me, and we were playing the same games, we were doing the same things for a while, and we learned some tactics, the old school tactics. The ones before all this extra technology and hacking and all that good stuff. And so, when we're playing these younger kids, they can outbuild us. Like when it comes to modern technical skills, they can outdo us any day of the week. Because we never learned how to We never took the time to learn how to build beyond just a ramp and a wall and, okay, provide some cover, cool. And then we go up and we do the sniping game or the grenade throwing game. I'm actually really skilled when it comes to grenades. My best friend, he drives, and I'm the one throwing grenades, halfway across the screen, and then, or throwing grenades like against a wall to make it bounce off there, and I use trigonometry and all that good stuff, and angles, because I'm autistic, a little bit of math, and he's really skilled when it comes to driving, like in real life, skilled. He's one of 2 people that I will say any day of the week can outdrive me, and only 2 people that I know of and have met. So yeah, we're playing these games, and we approach it from a place of experience and, in a way, wisdom. I know the tactics to mislead another person or to falsify where they think I'm going or to spook them out. Like, I know the tactics. I know how to take care of somebody who is camping. Camping is where basically you're hiding around a corner, not moving, so you're not making any sounds to alert anybody. And you're just basically waiting there like a hunter, waiting for a deer to cross by, and then bang! I know how to handle those people too, and how to spot them, and how to spot a good hideaway. But that came from experience. This new generation definitely has different levels of skill, and they have different perceptions on how to play the game. Like, more often than not, my best friend and I lose. We're getting better at it because we're adapting to the changes that this new generation is bringing to Fortnite. But more often than not, we lose. In fact, early on, we were so frustrated because we couldn't kill anybody. And then we're like, oh my gosh, we got a kill, yay! And we celebrated that small victory. And then we kept growing and we kept learning. It was a slower road because we were exposed to different things when we were younger. The environment was different. And now we have to adapt to this new environment. Because this new Fortnite environment, it's fun. It's challenging. And given the difference of playstyles, it's literally like Chinese math versus American math. We all teach differently when it comes to different countries, Eastern versus Western. Which one's better? Well, which one won? Which one beat the match? And what I'm referencing here is experience makes all the difference. But so is perspective. My best friend and I have to adapt to the perspective of these new video gamers that are much, much younger. Like, his son is a beast. An absolute beast in the video game. And the kid works at it and works at it and works at it and works at it. Like, he could genuinely compete. He is that good. He's that one kid that can go against squads, meaning one person, and everybody else has teams of 4. And he can do that and win. I've seen him do it. New generations, younger generations, they are hopefully better. It's the prerogative of each new generation to be better than the generation before. That's the prerogative. Point blank and simple. It is incumbent of each new generation to be better than one previously, but it's also incumbent of the previous generation to provide the means by which they can do so, to provide the foundation. My generation, that didn't happen. It didn't. Baby boomers, y'all failed. Let's just be completely real here. Y'all criticize, but y'all weren't brave when the war was done. I'm going to say that again. Y'all weren't brave when the war was done. You were afraid to be vulnerable with your feelings. It is what it is, right? You taught that to the next generation. That taught my generation. Though, technically, I was raised by baby boomers, like the tail end of them. But even so, antiquity is a real thing. Older generations don't want change. Change resistance is a real thing. We teach it in college. We do. I promise. And change management doesn't just apply to business. It applies to emotional states. It applies to a lot of different factors. And when we don't take change into consideration, what happens is antiquity ends up being projected onto the next generation. And that's not fair, because we're holding a new generation to standards that we held but aren't teaching. Okay? There are certain things not being taught by my generation to the next generation. There are. And the same thing happened with the previous generation, the same thing happened to the generation before that. We are arrogant as a nation. We are arrogant. And in our arrogance, we neglect to be vulnerable. We're afraid to be vulnerable because of the environment around us. And when parents aren't vulnerable with their kids, what that does is that teaches their children to knuckle up, man up, own up, stop being a wuss, and all those other expressions that are demeaning in nature. Oh, and that's the thing right there is, oh, it's demeaning in nature. Oh, grow up. I've made that argument before, and I've heard that response before. The older generations are afraid. They do not hold the bravery that they did when they went to war. When it comes to emotions, when it comes to teaching, to being vulnerable with your child unto adulthood. We are a cowardly nation in that respect. We are a narcissistic nation in that respect. Parents aren't talking to kids en masse. Parents are always working. Parents are always tired. JOB means just over broke, or at least that's the colloquial definition nowadays. And that's what people are. They're tired, they're worn out, and they don't want to invest the emotional vulnerability and the emotional fortitude to educate the next generation. Parents are afraid to have the talk with kids. Ask any parent. Like, seriously, this somehow has become a thing where parents don't want to talk about uncomfortable subjects with their children. We somehow got to that point, and we need to get over it. But at the same time, I also have to throw a boon and play devil's advocate on this one, because my entire life, I wasn't taught to be vulnerable. And only in the past year and a half have I truly been vulnerable. And I'll even go back as far as 3 to 4 years. But that vulnerability came from somebody giving me permission and a safe space to be vulnerable. Kids don't do that. They really don't. They will throw accusation. And it's up to the parent to man up, to own up, to stop being a wuss, to stop being a pansy. I'm using terms that those generations can identify with. I don't agree with those terms, but I still use them once in a while with my best friend when we're playing together, you know. I'm like, oh, I just lost this one thing over here. It's like, dude, man up, get over here. All right, you ready up? Ready. Then I'm on your 6, got it. Roger that. Okay, inside jokes can be inside jokes. But what happens when the parent has an inside joke that the kid can't keep up with or doesn't know about? The kid must then infer what the inside joke is, and instead of learning something new, they're having to learn something old because they aren't being educated. And a lot of parents are afraid to be vulnerable, and I get why. Vulnerability means somebody can attack you in a way that you're not used to being attacked. Or maybe you're all too used to being attacked that way. In fact, quite often it's like one extreme or the other. You're not used to it at all, like, oh my gosh, good chip lollipop. No, don't crack my lollipop. Or you're on the other side with, yeah, whatever. I've been there. Get away from me. How many of you can identify with one or the other or both? Seriously. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir right now. Because that's kind of what we've been doing. We've kind of been ignoring the important aspects of humanity. And in ignoring those important aspects of humanity, what we effectively do is we effectively diminish our causal response to be able to interact with one another. So, I'm just going to summarize it, because we have different generations teaching different generations. And each generation has a different environment. And we have to take into consideration where they were in that environment, what opportunities were available to them. Because a lot of opportunities were failed because of skin tone, because of religion, because of point of origin, because of war. Opportunities were granted under the same. And what we have to take into consideration are where those parents came from. But on the same token, each one of us is basically a child growing up into an adult. Anyone who says they have everything figured out is lying to you. I absolutely assure you of that. But some people have more figured out than others. And causally, as I reflect upon the whole concept of these older generations and their sayings, I take into account the historical evidence supporting those sayings. Why did they develop those sayings? Each generation has their own vernacular. They have their own, I guess you could say, nuances. It's why people can identify and have stories behind the different songs that they heard when they were growing up. Songs are a snapshot of cultural relevance. Same thing with movies. I mean, I grew up watching old movies, and I understand the old school. In fact, I very much respect it. And I respect some of the old ideologies. It's just, quite often we fail to adhere to the same ideologies. That's why we came up with the phrase a long time ago, practice what you preach. And all too often we've been failing as a species to practice what we preach. People aren't brave anymore. People aren't steadfast anymore. The term long-suffering is something everybody wants to avoid and is afraid of now. Poverty is something to be afraid of, right? Well, I'm here to tell you I've been homeless. And I've already built myself back up, and this will be the third time I've built myself up from basically losing almost everything. And we all have that capability. We just have to believe in ourselves. And I think one of the transgressions that can easily be remedied is the older generation is afraid to say I'm sorry. The same way my generation quite often will likely be afraid to say I'm sorry with some of the neglectful raising that some people in my generation have. Like seriously, each generation, especially if you're under 30 when you're having kids, when you get over the age of 30, you'll realize, oh my gosh, babies raising babies. And we've had that for quite some time. And through all of the challenges, like for example, the current generation, like my generation, millennials. So they have kids. They have children. And with all of that, I mean, there's so many that come home and they're just tired. So many working 2 jobs. So many working themselves constantly. I'm 17 years into a battle for stability. Like true stability. Not that temporary, oh, I'm good for about 6 months to a year. And I'm not the only one. And a lot of us have experienced setbacks. A lot of us have trusted in the wrong direction. But what's funny is previous generations can also relate to the same thing. I mean, Enron's a perfect example of that one. Woof. But there were so many more. And there were so many happenings in each generation. And I think we often fail to take into consideration what the previous generation has been through. But at the same time, my generation is willing to face personal traumas, personal failings. I have spent quite some time doing that. And if we take into account the past year of facing all the traumas of being an autistic individual in America, then yeah, I lost 50 pounds over the past year. And it's not an easy process to face your past, to face the things that happened to you, to face the things that you had to do to survive. And a lot of people in previous generations felt like they were doing everything they could to survive and provide as best they could for their families. I don't fault that. I do fault taking personal traumas out on a child. And taking personal traumas out on a child, that can be living vicariously through your child. And that is a movie stereotype. But you'll also see that extraordinarily in higher society. You will see that so often. Everything is about appearance up there. I used to be up there. I've also had a more adventurous life than most. And when I think about some of the people that I've known of the older generation, they've had some pretty adventurous lives too. And a lot of them felt helpless to fight some of the battles that needed to be fought. Some of them didn't have the education to do so. I'm coming at this from multiple different directions. The aggressive, the passive, and the understanding, empathetic. Because I think we all need to take into account these different manners and mannerisms. And I mean both, because etiquette back in the day is different than etiquette today. So manners, etiquette. But mannerisms, you want a biblical example on this. 40 days and 40 nights is the modern day equivalent, or my generation's equivalent, to a hot minute. It just meant a really long time. An undefined amount of time. So every generation has their own measure of speaking, measure of communicating with one another. And I somewhat lament the fact that in the past couple generations, we've digressed emotionally. We don't connect. We're afraid to talk to one another. Increasingly so. Begrudgingly, slowly, but increasingly so. And in that prospect, I think we lose self-identity in having to fit in with all of these strangers instead of developing compatriots, friends, allies. That's what helped me survive the world. Let me tell you something. I have plenty of allies, but they were cultivated, and they were earned and maintained. And some of them dissolved. But a cord of many strands is not easily broken. That's an old adage for the whole concept of networking and working together and working toward mutual vision and goal. And the older generations, they started to found this for us. So it's not that there's any disparaging, like complete disparaging of the previous generations, but I also lament the bravery. I wish there was more of that in how the older generations communicated with the younger generations. I was raised by my grandmother. My heart for people and the dedication I show to the Victory for Veterans Alliance, the VVA. So if you go to vva-usa.org, I am a director on the board. And basically we solve homeless female veterans. And we take into account therapeutic measures, PTSD, safe occupations, and vocational rehabilitation. A lot of big words. But there was a lot of time put into that. Not the words, the actual business plan. But I say that we are all a product of, number one, where we came from, and number two, where we choose to go. And I'm choosing to go towards a more humanitarian path. And I'm seeing more and more people of my generation and even older generations, many of whom I follow on TikTok and YouTube. Grandma's Gone Gaming on YouTube. She was fun. And I mean, kind of a boring fun. She plays Minecraft, but at the same time, she's fun. I like her. And I respect the older generations, and what I would like to see more of is the older generations respecting us. You can't keep looking at people as kids when they grow into adults. And then you can't be begging for forgiveness after they've already done so without you. And that's the barrier that we're running into right now. we all want to understand one another. There's a need for community, a sense of community. But there's also the disparaging gap of emotion, insecurity. I will be the first to say I have been an insecure person before. And a lot of that was trauma-based, based on environmental trauma. I'll take the first step on this one. I've been traumatized. And I chose to overcome it. And I hope that the older generations can admit that to themselves and also admit to maybe some of the failings that they're going to have that my generation's going to have and the next generation's going to have. But open communication is vital to all of us being able to communicate and to build a stronger and better community where we don't have us versus them. Anyway, stay safe out there. And try to walk into tomorrow as if tomorrow is already a better day than today. Y'all take care.